yeah. Va a ser en inglés, so yeah.
Okay.
Sorry for the misleading presentation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize that I'm going to speak in English. My Spanish is not good, so let me just talk to you a little bit about the outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. If I speak too fast, do stop me, all right? I'm from India, and Indians speak very fast. So if I do go very fast, stop me. So the presentation here is on how we see the outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll talk a little bit in between about Peru, but the focus is largely on the region. So before I do the presentation, let me give you a quick overview of what the key takeaways are from my presentation. The key takeaways are that growth in Latin America is gaining strength, but there are still significant downside risks. But more importantly, while growth is picking up, long-term prospects for Latin America are more subdued. I'll explain that as I go along. Second, in terms of what is needed in terms of policies, most or many countries in the region need to embark on further fiscal adjustment. Why is this? Because all these countries, which are commodity exporting countries, took a huge hit when commodity prices fell. So when commodity prices fell, these countries were hit by a shock, and to respond to that shock, they had to embark on adjustment. Many of them have already tightened fiscal policy, but more is needed to ensure that debt is sustainable and growth is durable. The good thing is inflation across many of these countries has been coming down. So when inflation is coming down, what it does is it allows monetary policy to have more space. So in terms of the policy mix, what countries in the region need are tight fiscal policy, but easing of monetary policy, some of which is already happening. The last thing is, given that long-term prospects for growth are subdued, all these countries require serious structural reform. I'll talk about what I mean by structural reform as I go along. So given that these are the key takeaways, let me go into my presentation. So what we see is across the world, global growth is picking up. In other words, many countries, or almost all countries in the world, are beginning to grow, and that is what we mean by broad-based global upswing. So if you look at our numbers, for example, for the US, we project the US will grow by 2.9% in 2018. This number has been revised up quite significantly from what we had in October, and I'll explain the reasons why. Similarly, you have Japan growing by 1.2%, Europe by 2.4%, and emerging markets by 4.9% in 2018. We expect growth to continue in 2019 as the numbers lay out here. So given what explains this broad-based global growth, the first thing to note is the US economy is growing very rapidly. In other words, the US economy is growing beyond potential, beyond its productive capacity. If you look at the first chart here, it tells you growth in the US. And what we have is 2.9% in 2018, and then we project growth further going forward. More importantly, you're having rapid growth, and unemployment is coming down very sharply. In fact, unemployment right now in the US is 3.9%. And that is usually when unemployment is so low, you would see inflation picking up. But what we see in the US is inflation is still pretty much subdued. Now, given growth being above potential, what we do see is a rise in both the trade deficit and the fiscal deficit. So what are the implications of this? We'll talk about that in a minute. So given that the US economy is growing so fast, wait a minute, what's happening here? Okay. So the US economy is doing very well. What does it mean for Latin America, and the Caribbean. If you look at the left-hand side, there's a map for Latin America, where everything is green except for one red part. That red is Venezuela. So Venezuela, the economy is contracting sharply. Growth is at, what do we have for Venezuela? It's a minus, it's negative and large negative. All the other countries in the region are growing in positive rates. Again, there are two shades of green here, the light green and the dark green. For example, a country, all these countries which have light green, growth is positive, but it is below historical averages. In other words, growth is positive, but it could be better than what it is right now. So for Venezuela, we expect growth at minus 15%. So that's the big red there. So besides Venezuela, all countries in Latin America have positive growth. So if you take Latin America as a whole, growth in 2018 is projected at 2%. And in 2019, it's 2.8%. More importantly, if we take Venezuela out, because Venezuela is growing at minus 15%, if you take Venezuela out, then Latin America is growing at 2.6% in 2018 and 3% in 2019. And below, I have listed the growth figures for Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. You can see that compared to last year, when some major countries were in recession, this year, no country other than Venezuela is in recession. Okay? Oh, God. So what explains the uptick in growth? In other words, why do we see growth coming back so strongly in Latin America? There are three key reasons. One, external demand has been very high. In other words, countries in Latin America have been able to increase their exports. So whether you look at the US, Japan, China, all these countries are growing so fast, and that explains why there's an increase in exports from Latin America. Second, commodity prices which collapsed are now coming up, so they're rising again. Again, the view is that they will not go up to the rates, to the prices, the levels you'd seen in the past, but still they're coming back. So this commodity prices going up helps countries like Peru, Chile, Colombia, all these which are commodity exporting countries. And the third reason why Latin America is doing very well compared to the past is that financial conditions, in other words, the rates at which countries can borrow, the rates at which corporates in Latin America can borrow, all that is quite favorable. So financing conditions are pretty good for Latin America, and that's a third reason why we see growth picking up. Now, beyond the external factors, is it all external? The answer is no. In all these countries, or in many of these countries, domestic demand is picking up. In other words, consumption, private investment, all that is gaining strength. If you look at this chart here, and if you look at 2018, the red, which has been circled, that's investment. So for a long time, investment in Latin America was not doing well. If you look at 2015 and 16, it's negative, right? So compared to 15 and 16, investment is doing very well, and you can see that on the right-hand side where for 2018 and 2019. And so with external conditions being good and domestic demand being very good, growth is gaining momentum. Now, what explains the pickup in investment? The pickup in investment can be explained by the fact that interest rates in Latin America have come down across most countries. Why have interest rates come down? Interest rates have come down because inflation in these countries has come down. If you look at the left-hand side chart here, look at the black line. The black line tells you where inflation was at its peak. For example, in Uruguay, inflation at its peak was 11%. Today, it's as low as 7% or 6.5%. So across most countries in the region, inflation has been coming down very sharply. Look at Brazil. Look at where the peak is and look at where the red dot is. right? So when inflation comes down so sharply, that allows central banks to ease monetary policy. And that's what is shown on the right-hand side chart. The right-hand side chart tells you that policy rates or interest rates have come down. And given that interest rates have come down, that helps investment to go up. And that explains why the previous chart you saw investment going up. And interest rates have been coming down, but at the same time, these countries have been tightening fiscal policy. And why do they have to tighten fiscal policy? Because they all face a commodity price shock, right? In 2012 onwards, commodity prices came down, so all these countries had to adjust their public accounts. And you can see that fiscal tightening has happened across most countries, or is happening across many countries in the region. So then the question is, if growth is picking up, what are the risks of the outlook? Are countries in Latin America and the Caribbean at risk of things not going right? And what are the kind of risks? There are basically 4 risks on the external side. The first one, as I said, as I mentioned, one of the reasons why growth has picked up is because financial conditions were pretty good for Latin America, right? The rate at which corporates could borrow, the rate at which countries could borrow was pretty good. Now, the risk is that could change. What if interest rates in the US start going up? When interest rates in the US start going up, the interest rates elsewhere also start going up, which means it becomes more expensive to borrow, and that would hurt growth prospects in Latin America. That's number one. Second, you may have read in newspapers a talk about trade wars, the US imposing tariffs on goods, and other countries saying they'll retaliate. So there's a risk that countries start imposing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, which means there's a risk of trade wars. And when you have trade wars, nobody wins, right? And Latin America would again hurt. The third vulnerability is what happens in China. Now, as you know, China and Latin America have very close links, mainly because China is a big consumer of what Latin America exports, mainly commodities, whether it's copper, zinc, any kind of mineral, oil, and so on. So to the extent that whatever happens in China has a bearing on Latin America, if there are financial vulnerabilities in China, if they go up, that would hurt Latin America. And finally, when I talk about extreme weather events, I'm talking about countries which are exposed to natural disasters, like hurricanes, like the Caribbean, right? So these are the 4 key risks we see to the outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. What is the domestic risk? The domestic risk, again, are twofold. One, many countries in Latin America are going for elections. Brazil, Mexico, Chile just had its elections, and so on. So a number of countries are going through to elections. What does that mean for policy? Does that increase policy uncertainty? Why? So those are the kind of risks which impact Latin America, could impact countries. And second, what's happening in Venezuela? What's happening in Venezuela? There's an economic crisis, there's a humanitarian crisis. That can have spillovers to other countries in the region, and that's a risk to these countries. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the last part I have here is uncertainty. As you all may have learned or may have read in newspapers, the US has announced a large tax reform, a huge tax reform. That will likely have implications for countries in Latin America. I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are the risks we see to the region, which is just coming out of a funk. So here's a chart which I talked about financial conditions. Now, what does this chart show? This chart basically has, on the x-axis, it has the US policy rates. On the y-axis, it has a measure of what we call financial conditions index. It provides a measure of how easy or difficult financial conditions are. When you go up, it becomes more tight. When you go down, it is more relaxed. What this chart tells you is that despite the US Federal Reserve tightening interest rates, financial conditions have been pretty easy for countries in Latin America more generally. That's what this chart can do here. So the green bubbles or the green dots is what's happening between 2015 and now. So even though the US Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates, financial conditions remain accommodative for countries across the world. But if these interest rates, if the financial conditions change, if they become tighter, that can have implications for Latin America. So on the right-hand side, you have a chart which shows what are the financing requirements. In other words, how much do countries need to borrow to finance the country, to finance their growth outlook. There what we see is some countries have large financing needs. For example, look at Dominica, look at Chile, look at Nicaragua. These countries have large financing requirements as shown by the red triangles, or red, what do you call the diamonds. Whereas if you look at a country like Brazil, which is not growing very fast, but its needs to borrow are not that large. So in other words, when financial conditions change or become tight, some countries are going to be affected more than others. Okay? And that's a key risk which you had to watch out for. The second, here's an example, as I said, there's a risk of trade wars, right? So here we've done some simple analysis. And again, let me just explain it in very simple words. Suppose the US were to say that I'm going to increase tariffs on all goods coming into the US. Okay? They raise tariffs to where they are, from where they are right now, to what we call as MFN status levels. So if the US increases tariffs, okay, and countries don't react, okay, so suppose the US increases tariffs on what Peru exports to the US or what Chile exports to the US. What happens? And then we're assuming here that other countries keep quiet, they don't do anything. Even then, even if no countries retaliate, you can see on the right-hand side that GDP will fall, right? GDP levels will fall. And this is when nobody retaliates. But if all countries start saying, if US increases tariff, so will I, right? And it's likely to happen. If the US starts imposing tariff, other countries start doing something similar, and there's a trade war. If there's a trade war, then things could look even worse than what we show on the right-hand side. That's an effect of trade wars. I talked about tax reforms in the US. What US has done, US has lowered its corporate tax rate from 35% to the average, which is about 21%. So they've lowered corporate tax rates from 35% to 21%. What does that mean for other countries in the region? There are two risks here, and that's what the right-hand side chart shows. On the right-hand side chart, you have two colors, blue and purple. The blue, let's just focus on the blue here for Mexico. What this bar tells you is that the amount that Mexico collects, the amount that Mexican government collects from foreign companies in terms of taxes, that is about more than 5% of all corporate tax revenues that Mexico collects. This is a large share. So if that taxes revenues dissipate, Mexico faces a fiscal risk, right? Because now they are going to collect less, potentially going to collect less, and that will affect their fiscal balance sheets. Look at the purple chart here. The purple bar. What it shows is what is the level of income, foreign pre-tax income, generated by foreign companies in Canada as a share of Canadian GDP. That's about 5%. In other words, what the amount of income that foreign companies generate in Canada is about 5% of Canada's GDP. And if that stops, that can have a big impact on economic activity in Canada. So you could roughly think of that as the investment risk. So if investment comes down, then that activity is going to take a big hit and will affect Canada. So that's the risk, that's the uncertainty. So how US tax reform affects these countries will vary. It varies, and that is the uncertainty. And I mentioned about the domestic risk. The domestic risk in Latin America is that many countries are going for elections. For example, Brazil is going for elections later this year. Chile just had its elections. Colombia, Mexico are having elections. In all these countries, the current presidents are hugely unpopular. For example, in Brazil, the president has a approval rating of 8%, right? Similarly, in Mexico, the president's approval rating is in the 12%, 13%, whatever it is. The fact is these presidents have low approval ratings, and they're going for elections. The risk is, after the elections, will these countries do something in terms of policies which could make things difficult? That's a question to ask, right? Will they do things which make these countries unsustainable, growth, volatility increase? So that's a huge risk there, or what we call as risk of populism. So when new governments come in, will they be more populist, or will they be more orthodox? That's a question. That's the uncertainty. So I'll stop here. So the one point I would make here is, so far we've talked about what's happening in the near term. Growth is picking up. What do they need to do in terms of fiscal adjustment and monetary policy adjustment? But as I mentioned, if you look at long-term growth rates in Latin America, it's about 1.8%. So over the long run, Latin America is projected to grow by 1.8%, which is pretty low, right? It is pretty low. So to boost that growth rate, what do countries need to do? And that and others, my colleague Hamid will talk about in a minute. No questions now? Do you have questions at this point, or should we leave questions for later? We're going to do it later? Yeah.
Okay, so Krishna has kind of given you the overview of how we see the outlook for the global economy, the outlook for the US, outlook for Latin America. I'll turn to some of the challenges that the region faces going ahead. And this is drawing on some of the analysis in our report. So as of today, if you go to imf.org, you'll find the Regional Economic Outlook for 2018, and you can download the report and read it for yourself. You'll be able to read a lot of the global themes that so this is the copy of the report that you can get electronically on the web. And you'll be able to read about a lot of the themes that Krishna has talked about. So what I'll try to do is maybe give you a little bit more flavor of some other things that are in the report. Maybe I'll skip this part just to keep things short. In the report, we actually do some work on central bank communication. There, I think what I would emphasize is that the reactions that central banks take to key shocks really hinges on how credible those central banks are. What do I mean by credible? Well, one important measure is how well are expectations anchored in the private sector. There's a chart here, for example, that shows you that when you have greater credibility of the central bank, you get less of a risk that inflation expectations, medium-term inflation expectations, drift away from where you want them to go. So you can see that if you move to the right here, if you're a country like Chile, where inflation expectations are very well anchored, and you're faced with a terms of trade shock like the one that Krishna was talking about earlier, you might see very little movement in inflation expectations as a deviation from the target. But as you move to the left and you become less credible, there's a greater risk that inflation expectations can drift away from where you want them to be. What's the implication of that? Well, if you look at the right panel, this is based on the same analysis. This is from some vector autoregression with a panel of 20 inflation targeting central banks. what the right panel shows you, the same scale on the horizontal axis, but now it shows you what the interest rate reaction is to that same shock. So if you hit these central banks with the same type of shock, the less credible ones, the ones to the left, will tend to have to raise interest rates to keep inflation expectations anchored. But the ones that are more credible actually have more room to maneuver and can actually ease policy rates. You see the purple bars going downward in response to this shock. So the behavior of monetary policy very much depends on how credible the central bank is, going into the episode. In terms of the chapter, if you have a chance to read it, you'll see some of the reasons why we argue that's the case. One of the key factors is the role of transparency. So the more transparent you are as a central bank, the more predictable your policy is, and that's what this scatter plot shows you on the left-hand side. And there's also a nice relationship between central bank transparency and also this degree of anchoring of expectations, this measure of credibility. And again, we tend to find this relationship that higher transparency moving in this direction associated with higher credibility, which is moving down, so down and to the right. And the same thing for predictability. Again, you can find those details in the report if you're interested. Maybe just to mention one thing that's kind of fun, that's a little bit innovative in this report, is we look at how, not just about how much communication is out there, the quantity, but also the quality of communication. How effective is that communication? And so what this left panel shows you is how readable are documents that central banks produce. And the higher the bars, the more readable they are. And then we compare them to, for example, how readable newspapers are, which is the black diamonds. We keep Brazil separate because we do Brazil in English, and we do Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru in Spanish. And you can see that if you take Peru, for example, it does fairly well. The central bank's documents, its inflation reports, press releases, minutes, tend to be as readable or more readable than the newspaper. The purple line is how readable our report is. So you can compare how readable we are compared to the central banks. But what's interesting is that if you look at the right panel, the more readable these documents are, it tends to be associated with greater predictability of monetary policy decisions. And that's, again, something that you can read about in the analysis. Let me focus a little bit more on fiscal adjustment. Krishna talked about that many countries in the region have the need for fiscal adjustment. Maybe just to motivate that further, I want you to take a look at this chart. If you look at the left panel, this shows you gross public debt as a ratio to GDP for Latin America and the Caribbean. That's the purple line here on the left panel. And you can see it's been rising for a number of years as we moved into a period of lower commodity prices and lower growth. Debt has risen throughout the region. And you can see that where in 2008 Latin America looked close to the average of emerging markets, that's the red line there, now it's quite a bit above and still rising. And in our forecast, we expect it to rise even further. So with that as context, fiscal adjustment is planned in many countries. And how do we see that? Well, if you look at the right panel, this shows you our projections. The blue bars show you the change in fiscal positions in terms of the primary balance in percent of GDP from 2017 into 2019. And you can see that for many countries, they're trying to improve fiscal positions. There's fiscal tightening that's going on, and you see that there. But also notice that the amount of adjustment that you see in the primary balance is still well short in many cases of the amount that's needed to stabilize debt. And that's these little red lines there in the right panel. And that's partly why debt continues to rise in the left panel. So even though there's fiscal adjustment that's going on, it's still not enough to stabilize debt in many cases. And that's partly this issue that it's going to require many years of sustained effort for governments to kind of bring debt under control. Otherwise, debt will continue to rise. So one of the things that we look at in this Regional Economic Outlook, this year's report, is what might be the cost of that? What would it mean in terms of growth to see that kind of fiscal adjustment that I showed you on the previous slide. And you can think about this concept of a fiscal multiplier, what the economic impact or GDP impact is in the short run from fiscal consolidation, from tighter fiscal policies. What the left panel shows you, if you look at the purple diamond, that's kind of an average estimate from the literature. This is from a survey of about 40 papers, 140 estimates of multipliers. The purple diamond shows you what the average estimate is for a fiscal multiplier, and it's pretty low. It's close to zero, if you can see that, in low in absolute terms. And if it were that low, and we believe it, then the cost of fiscal adjustment wouldn't be all that much because the multiplier is small. It's a lot lower than what the average is for advanced economies, which is the red diamond. So there, fiscal adjustment hurts in terms of growth. You have a bigger multiplier, bigger negative impact on GDP. So one of the things we do in this year's report is we revisit those estimates. And one of the things we do is we actually broaden the types of methods that are typically used to estimate multipliers. In the past, people have used fewer methods to estimate multipliers for Latin America than for advanced economies. And we've tried to broaden out the types of methodologies that we use. And if you do that, you end up with a range that looks like the green range. I don't know if you can see the green area there in the slide, but that's the range of point estimates that we get across three different methods. One is based on structural VARs. Another is based on forecast errors to identify fiscal shocks. And a third method, which is fairly new to Latin America, is the use of the so-called narrative approach. This means actually reading budget documents and trying to identify fiscal actions that we think aren't related to the economic cycle, and using those to identify fiscal actions and then tracking what the multiplier effect is. And if you do that, you find a range that suggests that the multipliers, the growth impact, is actually larger than maybe what we thought before. And that's something that that policymakers should keep in mind as they think about fiscal adjustment plans going forward. And in one particular dimension that we emphasize in the report is the composition of that fiscal adjustment. So if you look at the right panel, what we do is we separate what the multipliers look like depending on the type of fiscal instrument, whether you're cutting primary expenditure or whether you're cutting public investment. And based on the analysis that we've done, but also that other people have done, you tend to find that the multipliers, this is the impact on GDP after 2 years from that cut in fiscal spending, depends on the type of fiscal spending that you're cutting. So whether you're cutting primary expenditure, you tend to get a lower multiplier, and when you're cutting public investment, you're getting a bigger multiplier, a bigger drag on growth if the fiscal adjustment is heavy in that dimension. Why do I bring this up? Well, if you look back to the fiscal plans that countries are doing, the type of fiscal adjustment, the budget tightening, the belt tightening, as they like to say, if you look at the composition of that adjustment, in many cases, a lot of governments are adjusting their budgets by cutting public investment. And that's a concern to us, for the reasons that maybe are evident on the slide on the right. Just to kind of bring this point home, if you look at a longer horizon, which is what the left panel shows, you see that the change in what we call the cyclically adjusted primary balance is expected to improve quite a bit if you look out to 2020 for a lot of economies. A lot of economies are taking a lot of effort to adjust their fiscal positions, given growth has been lower, as Christian talked about, even that the prospects for growth are subdued. And what that translates in terms of the impact on growth, if you go from the left panel to the right panel, really depends on the composition of that spending. If that composition is really heavy towards public investment cuts, you'll get potentially the pressure on GDP that is captured by the red diamonds. If you have what we think is a better composition, a growth-friendly composition of adjustment, you might get a smaller impact on growth as suggested by the blue bars. Again, the details are in the report, and if you are interested, we certainly encourage you to take a look. Let me turn to the issue of income inequality and poverty reduction. We have a chapter looking at the gains that Latin America has made over the last several years, over more than a decade, in terms of reducing income inequality and poverty. A lot of those gains occurred during the period of high commodity prices. You can see here in the first panel, this shows you the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality that for Latin America, it's the only region in the world, since 2000 that actually saw a kind of steady decline in income inequality, over the last 15 years or so. That's the good news. The less than good news is, that bar is still very high, that income inequality is the highest really, for this region compared to, other emerging market regions. When you unpack that number, those bars, and look at individual changes in income inequality, the middle panel shows you how individual countries did during this period. If you look at the red circles reflect commodity importers, net commodity importers, and the blue circles reflect net commodity exporters. So you can see that in general, the change in the Gini is in the right direction. It's been coming down for both groups. Maybe slightly better for the commodity exporters. It looks fairly close. The horizontal axis shows you what their terms of trade have done during this period. So obviously for commodity exporters, during the commodity cycle, you had improvement in the terms of trade, and so they're to the right of zero, whereas commodity importers have tended to be to the left of the zero line in that chart. Perhaps more striking is the right panel. It's the same group of countries, again, the commodity importers and exporters in red and blue. And this time we show you what the poverty rate has done over this period. And what's kind of striking in that figure is how much progress we've seen in the commodity exporters in those blue circles, and almost kind of like almost nicely correlated with the degree of improvement in the commodity terms of trade over this time period. And one of the things the chapter looks at is how, what are some of the mechanisms through which income inequality and poverty reduction have improved, particularly for the commodity exporters, where obviously you had a very positive development with higher commodity prices, higher terms of trade for them. So if you look at this left panel, this shows you the composition, this is for Bolivia and Peru, the composition of households' total income. And you can see that the dominant share of total income is from labor income. It dominates the other categories, transfers and non-labor income. And that is true in both periods. And when you try to relate the changes in income inequality and poverty that we saw in the previous chart, if you try to do a decomposition, the biggest explanatory factor, which you can see in the purple bars in the right two panels, is improvements in labor income. There have been several studies, not only ours but others, that have talked about a compression in the skills premium during the period of high commodity prices, and that's an improvement in terms of labor income gains, employment gains for people on the lower end of the income and wage distribution, and we find that that's an important factor in understanding what's happened. I think one of the bigger questions we have is what's going to happen going forward. You have this employment growth that the commodity exporters have enjoyed as an advantage over the commodity importers. That's the purple versus the gray bar. That picture doesn't look quite as optimistic, in the last couple of years, partly with commodity prices at a lower level. And the idea that we have in the chapter is what will it take to secure the gains that we've seen in terms of lower poverty, lower income inequality going forward, if you can't rely on the same things that we've relied on in the past, in the terms of the labor income gains that higher commodity prices have brought about. So part of what's in the chapter, and again, I won't go into details, but to look at some of the policy implications of that to kind of ensure that the kinds of gains that we've seen in these key social indicators continue going forward. Let me just turn to the last topic, and then happy to take your questions, and talk about what Krishna mentioned at the beginning about sober or low growth prospects for Latin America and the Caribbean. This chart kind of shows you what we see as some key factors behind that. So if you look at the left panel, you look at what we call gross fixed capital formation, just think investment. It's lower, it's as low or low in Latin America as almost every other emerging market region. We tend to invest less here than other emerging market regions. There are reasons behind that. We think issues such as lack of infrastructure may be a factor that holds back growth. There are issues with the business environment, which the World Bank has developed several indicators about that. The IDB has done work about factors that weigh on saving and low saving being associated with low investment. If you look at the middle panel, this is a slide that should be of interest to everybody here. It's on educational outcomes and spending. You can see that Latin America and the Caribbean also tends to do relatively weaker performance in terms of the PISA scores. In terms of that the OECD does to compare educational outcomes, attainment levels across economies. What's interesting to me is that the educational outcomes tend to be relatively weaker, but the amount of public education spending doesn't look relatively weaker. It's actually on par or even higher than other regions. So we're not getting as much from our education money as we'd like to. The right panel talks about another issue that we worry about for Latin America, which is on trade. And you can see that from when you compare Latin America to other emerging market regions, the degree of trade openness is less in Latin America. If you were to do measures of intra-regional trade, how much Latin America trades with itself, you would find lower levels of trade flows for this region than for a lot of other emerging market regions. And we've done some other work, not in this report, but earlier studies that show that there's a potential growth impact from that lack of trade integration. Finally, let me, yeah, we're talking about crime? No? Okay. Okay, yeah. One other thing in the study, I won't talk about it now, but we'll open up for questions, is on the issue of crime and growth. If you're interested in that, again, definitely take a look at the report. But right now, we'll be happy to take any of your questions that you have on anything that I've presented or Krishna's presented. The floor is yours.
No questions at all? Anyone?
Broadly agree?
I guess we were pretty boring, right?
Let me talk about homicide rates then. Okay, yeah, please. Please. Mm-hmm.
And our currently, I don't know the numbers exactly, but I would say that the majority of our revenues comes from consumption tax, not income tax.
Right.
How to do that?
Right, right. It's a great question. It's a difficult question. I think the answer is going to depend very much on the individual economy's tax structure, level of informality, level of how well they can mobilize tax collection, those types of issues. Let me talk a little bit specifically about, say, Paraguay, because I know Paraguay fairly well. Paraguay is an interesting case because they have very low tax rates. They have something called 10-10-10. They're very proud of it. They have 10% personal income taxes, 10% VAT, 10% corporate income taxes. what they collect from personal income taxes, even with that low tax rate, what they collect from personal income taxes is only 0.1% of GDP. So even with such a low tax rate, what they do is they have a very generous system of deductions. So what you can actually declare as your income, your personal income, is actually can be very low because you can deduct just about everything. So even with a low tax rate, they have set up a system where the deductibility makes the tax base very, very small in the case of personal income taxes. Now, part of that is because Paraguay didn't have personal income taxes, so this was a way for them to transition into having a system, a little bit more formality in terms of the tax code. And the idea, I think, for them going forward is to think about tax reform. So how to change, even within the system that they have, how to collect more taxes, even under the statutory tax rates that they have. And so they're thinking about ways to reduce the degree of income tax deductions that people are allowed, maybe make them even means tested, meaning like depending on their level of income. And if you do things like that, you can improve the progressivity of taxes. But right now you have a system where it's actually, you rely, as you were saying, you rely a lot on consumption taxes, VAT, which isn't the most progressive, right? And so if you're not collecting much from personal income taxes and you're relying on other types of sources of taxes, it doesn't improve the progressivity of the system. So each country's going to have to look at ways in which it can maybe broaden the tax base. That's certainly one aspect of it. Improve the efficiency of tax collection, improve things like, again, it depends on the country, taxpayer identification numbers in a lot of countries aren't fully, not everyone has assigned a taxpayer identification number, or they don't have enough of them assigned. Oftentimes you have the tax authority doesn't have the resources to collect the taxes or to audit people or to enforce the audits that they do. So all those kinds of channels are things in which, again, depending on the country that we're talking about, are ways in which you can try to improve tax collection, particularly for personal income taxes, which are relatively low. Paraguay is an extreme case, the 0.1% that they collect. But even in Latin America in general, personal income taxes are relatively low. And then I think there are lots of avenues in which you could try to improve that.
Maybe Ravi can talk a little bit about Bolivia. I'm sorry, about Peru, what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, just to complement what Khalid said, if you compare Latin America with other regions, the big difference is VAT.
Wait for them. Microphone.
Personal income tax as a percent of GDP is low. So if you want to spend more on social protection, for example, or on infrastructure, you need to have the resources to do that. So how can you do that? You don't necessarily want to have too high tax rates, but as Hamid was saying, you need to broaden the base. So part of the debate that's going on here is about broadening the base, reducing a lot of tax exemptions, so that you generate more taxes without having unnecessarily high tax rates, which will lead to further tax avoidance. So I think that's the challenge and the art, and you're right, you've got to take into account informality. It's very high in Peru. But if you just look at the overall redistribution, as Hamid was saying, of the tax and transfer system, Latin America has very little redistribution, whereas compared to, say, more countries with higher per capita income, they tend to have much higher redistribution and progressivity in their tax and transfer system. So it's not just about the tax side, also on the expenditure side, means testing benefits is obviously something which is quite important, I would say. Yeah.
Talking about that, sorry, you have a study comparing tax exemptions to the Latin American countries? Because I suppose, I don't know another country, but I suppose that in Peru, tax exemptions are very high. But I don't know if in other countries that's
yeah, I mean, you get tax exemptions in many countries. I'm not exactly sure what the level of tax exemptions is or tax expenditures are in Peru, but you can clearly see that the tax to GDP ratio is very low. And it's partly declined because of the declining commodity prices, but it's one of the lowest in the region when you compare it to other OECD countries. And the government's made that very clear as well, that one of their objectives is to try and increase tax revenues. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly scope to reduce a lot of tax exemptions.
Maybe just to add to what Ravi said, in terms of cross-country comparisons, our fiscal we're not in the Fiscal Affairs Department, but our Fiscal Affairs Department has collected data on, on issues like tax exemptions, tax expenditures. I've looked at the Paraguay data, and Paraguay stands out. I don't know where Peru falls in some of these measures, but we do have some cross-country information on that. But I think in general, when you look at the region as a whole, compared to other emerging market regions, I think you'll generally find that certainly the level of taxes, tax collection from personal income taxes to GDP, certainly as a simple measure, tends to be much lower ratio for much of Latin America compared to other regions.
Just one other thing about another source is the OECD came out with a recent study on this, revenues in Latin America, and they highlighted as well that the personal income tax segment is one area which seems to be stand out compared to other regions.
I have another question. Turning to monetary effectiveness, I was very surprised when you show us about the very low credibility you assign to Peruvian Central Bank. Maybe you can tell us more, how do you estimate the credibility?
Sure. Well, let me show it in two separate pictures, because I think any one measure is not going to be perfect. So I'll give you multiple measures, and they're in the chapter, but I'll mention. So maybe let me give you the positive story first, and then I'll give you the more. So if you look at the right panel here, what this chart shows you is that this concept of exchange rate pass-through. When the exchange rate changes, how much does inflation go up or down? Has been generally declining in Latin America. When the exchange rate moves, less is passed through to inflation. And you can see that with the purple bars going down. That's the height of the bars is measuring pass-through. At the same time that that's happened, the red diamonds are showing that the anchoring of inflation expectations is actually going up. That inflation expectations are more anchored now than they were, say, in 2007. And in this case, the anchoring is measured in terms of, we look at market expectations of inflation and how much disagreement, how much dispersion there is in those expectations measures. So as that dispersion goes down, there's kind of more agreement among, say, private forecasters, and then that anchoring actually goes up. So for Latin America, the LA5 at least, you can see that anchoring of inflation expectations has actually gone up over this period. It's not as high quite yet as advanced economies, which is you can see the diamonds on the first part of the chart. But it's quite a bit better than other parts of Latin America. So among the major central banks in Latin America, you actually have achieved quite a bit of inflation anchoring, expectations anchoring. And we attribute that to lots of different things, but importantly, the introduction of inflation targeting frameworks over the last 20 years in much of the region, greater central bank independence, some movements towards central bank greater central bank transparency. Those types of things will help, we think, in terms of anchoring inflation expectations. The chart that came after it gives you a range, right? So in this one, what we show, the horizontal axis is a little bit more complicated. Here we look at a distribution of central banks and how well inflation is anchored before, in the period before, so in a prior period. And so we look at, some countries have achieved quite a bit of anchoring in terms of, how close inflation expectations stay to the target. They don't vary very much around that target. And we have a distribution around that. And then the ones that are in the higher end of the distribution have the tightest, the least amount of movement around the inflation target. So the inflation expectations tend not to move very much, deviate very much from the inflation objective. And then so the ones that have very tight variance there, they get a high score in terms of credibility, and the ones that have more variance around it get a lower score. I mean, you can see that for Latin America, there's a grouping of countries that kind of fall broadly in that same category, and there's some variation, for some countries beyond that. What we wouldn't emphasize so much exactly any particular ranking. This is one particular score. There are other ways to measure that credibility. I think the bigger point we want to make from this is that wherever you are on this scale tends to influence then how you can behave when a shock hits you. So here we have a common shock that's hitting all these economies. And the ones where the anchoring is better, they tend to have more room for maneuver because inflation expectations aren't at risk of drifting higher. And if they're not at risk of drifting higher, then you have more policy options when the shock hits you. So even if the shock is inflationary, so I'd say it's a terms of trade shock where we have weaker terms of trade, weaker exchange rate, you still have some pass-through, you have higher inflation. Inflation expectations may stay anchored, and then that gives you a little bit more breathing space in terms of what you do with your interest rates. And that's a little bit the message from this slide. I think that if you look at the chapter, what we try to do is emphasize ways in which you can try to improve that anchoring. So it's not a one for all. You can make improvements in your monetary policy framework, or at least in terms of your communication framework. You could improve central bank transparency. There are ways in which you can do that. The amount of information that you release to the public is part of that story. In this case, the predictability is in the left panel is what we're emphasizing. So here we look at what the market's expecting policies to do, not inflation, but policies to do before a policy decision is taken. And so we look at what did the market expect on the day before, and then we look at then what happens. And then we look at the forecast error that the market's made. And if the forecast error goes down, we call that more predictability. If the forecast error stays large, we call that less predictable. And you can see that there's a fairly telling correlation, at least, that the central banks that are more transparent tend to be more predictable. The private sector, the markets tend to know a little bit better what's going to happen next. And that's a little bit what the chapter talks about. But it's more than just transparency. It's more about just how much you communicate, how much information you provide, but also how well you communicate. In terms of the analytic framework we have in mind, it's a little bit like a signal-to-noise ratio. So when the central bank can give a lot of signal with not too much noise, then markets can pick that up and react to it. If you give too much information, you might give noise as well as signal. And so there's a little bit of a balancing act on your communication. How well you communicate, the effectiveness, depends on more than just transparency and how much information you provide, but the quality of that information as well.
Any question on the IMF? From the students, any questions on the IMF on what we do?
Two quick questions. Among the global risk, which one do you think is the more likely? And my second question is, in the next decades, what do you think will be the role of India in the global economy?
So in terms of external risk, I think what I think is very important is how to plan.
Francisco?
I have no answer for that question, sorry. Are you a student?
So I think two risks to highlight. One is the issue of financing conditions. See, financing conditions for Latin America has been very good for the last few years. So what happens if that tightens? One, that tightens, and if that tightening happens abruptly, okay? Now, that can have serious implications for countries in Latin America, because especially for those which have large borrowing needs. The second issue is of protectionism. I mean, you talk about trade wars. In a trade war, nobody wins, right? If America imposes higher tariffs, other countries will retaliate, and that'll go, so it'll keep going back and forth, back and forth. That is a serious risk. And it all depends upon how, NAFTA turns out. The NAFTA negotiations are ongoing right now. How that pans out is important. So I think these two risks of protectionism and of financing condition are the important ones. In terms of India, I don't think India can play the same role as China. India is not such a big player in terms of commodity exports and so on. Yes, India will continue to grow at 6-7%, but it cannot compete with China in that sense. So China is the link between China and Latin America are very, very strong. In fact, we are doing some work on that, which tells you that if you take out China, the links between Latin America and Asia are pretty weak. So in that sense, I don't think India can be a big player. The Managing Director has issued a statement yesterday in terms, there was a team from Argentina in Washington to negotiate, to talk about a program, and that's where we are right now. We can't say anything more on that at this point in time.
If you look at the report itself, without specific references to any individual country, but we have a box in the report that talks about market perceptions. So not our views of risks, but markets participants' views of risks in the region, and they talk about some of the things that were on their mind. This was as of March, early March, so you can have a read there on what if you look in the report, what they were worried about coming into the current episode.
So if any of the students ask me a question, I'll give you a gift. This will be a gift for you. One question. We want you to ask questions. Be bold. Don't feel scared of us. Ask questions. Yes, there you go.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the regional spillovers from Venezuela? How can the economic and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela affect Peru? In how many ways can it affect us?
I think what's happened in Venezuela has already been internalized by markets, right? So it's been this crisis has been going for 3-4 years now. So markets have dealt with that problem. They've internalized that in prices and so on. I think the bigger challenge from Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis. You see a number of people leaving the country and going into Colombia, Brazil, and so on. That will impose a cost on these countries. So that is the kind of spillovers you'll see. Beyond spillovers, I think what's happening in Venezuela is very sad. There's a huge dearth of medical facilities. Basic necessities are not there, right? People are not being able to fulfill basic necessities. So that is a bigger challenge. But in terms of spillovers, the one is mostly the humanitarian one, the refugees going in and out of the country and so. And I think so. I'm not sure what the numbers are for Peru. Do you know whether there have been any inflows into Peru?
Hamid was saying the numbers have been obviously larger for Colombia and Brazil, but I think we expect the numbers to continue going up in the next few years for many of the neighboring countries, and then cities will have to absorb some of the migrants. Sorry? 200,000.
200,000?
Yeah.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for your time and for being here. One more question. Also wants an
I have one copy. I'll give you one.
I have a question about regional integration. Really, I don't know really because I have read about many pacts between Latin American countries like the Alianza del Pacífico, CAN, Comunidad Andina, Mercosur. Yet you said that there has been a lack in it, and I don't know if it's because mostly the private companies don't want to take the risk or don't have the resources, or is it because a lack of, how to say it, ease on going to other countries because of new taxes, problems with the government, tariffs between Latin American countries? What would be the best way to promote the regional integration economically?
It's a good question. I don't know if I can find any single answer to your question. I would say it's a combination of things. You have in Latin America a very complex arrangements of regional trade agreements. People call it the spaghetti bowl between Mercosur, the Andeans. You have lots of a fragmented trade agreement system within Latin America. We talked a little bit about the low investment you saw in that chart that I showed you before. Some of that low investment is partly on infrastructure, so lack of distribution, transportation networks within Latin America, I think, is an issue. You also have a couple other more subtle issues. One of the reasons why trade integration is high in Asia is partly the presence of global supply chains, these value chains. You see less of that in Latin America. There are a lot of reasons for that. Partly the barriers that I mentioned, but also this idea of the types of goods that Latin America produces and where they are in terms of the value chain and being integrated in the value chain, I think is a question on our minds. We wrote, not in this report, but in our regional report 2 years ago, we did some work on trade flows within the region and comparing them to other emerging market regions. And we found that there was some evidence that Latin America undertrades with itself. That given there's a standard kind of framework, this kind of gravity model, equations, and so forth. You look at things like economic size and distance and those kinds of things. You try to control for all of that. And when you do that, you still find that maybe Latin America should be trading more than otherwise. So there's a question mark for us on some of that, on some of those reasons. We've had this trade cluster report, this broader study that looked at some of the barriers, maybe try to explain that residual that we got in the other study. And I think one of the punchlines from that, but I think there are multiple punchlines, but I think one of the punchlines is definitely this issue of infrastructure barriers to the flow of
In fact, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at take any country in Latin America, say take Peru, and see where Peru is exporting its goods, right? And you compare infrastructure of who Peru competes with. All of the countries which Peru competes with have better infrastructure than Peru. So that's a big thing. Infrastructure networks are pretty bad in Latin America. The other reason which Hamid mentioned is Latin America does not have a China. For example, in Asia, China is a hub. So all countries trade with China and through China to the rest of the world. In Latin America, you don't have that. Even though Brazil is the biggest country in the region, the network between Brazil and the rest of Latin America is not strong. So those kind of networks are missing in Latin America, and that needs to be built through better trade, trade integration acts, and so on and so forth.
I have a question.
Yes,
please.
Well, actually, I was very curious about the gaps that you were just talking about. Do you really think that between Latin America we should really increase the sales we could have between countries, and in what kind of areas? Because, for example, in case of Peru, we are one of in case of exporting agro, for example, products, we know that we don't have the value chain so developed, so we just export commodities or very low scale developed products. And our partners, for example, Colombia has the same situation, and also Brazil. So I was asking, do we really need to continue selling between us if we have more or less same conditions, or I'm just supposing bad because I'm not that into what you really have research with.
Right. Yeah, so I think these are good questions. I don't know if I have easy answers for you. Let me give you some ideas, and hopefully you guys will come up with the answers and tell us. On the issue of diversification, economic diversification, we know that Latin America has talked about it for many, many years, but the amount of progress on economic diversification can be limited in many cases. That not as much progress as we would have liked to have seen away from, say, commodities, for example, in South America has taken place. It was hard to diversify away from commodities when commodity prices were high. It was very profitable to be in commodities, and that would actually absorb a lot of resources, going into that sector. In the slides I showed you earlier, there was some payoffs to that commodity boom in terms of lower poverty, lower income inequality. But we've done some other work when we look at diversification, and we haven't seen as much inroads, gains in increasing economic diversification in Latin America. And again, there may be many barriers to that. Another dimension, which is an idea that Ricardo Hausmann talks about from Harvard, is this notion of economic complexity. Slightly different from diversification. They're related, but they're distinct as well. That the types of products we make here tend to be at a certain place on the value ladder. You know, they don't move up the value ladder in terms of complexity, and that may have implications for what the gains are from greater integration with other trading partners, creation of value chains. So if you have low complexity, there may be not a lot of scope to improve or to be part of a value chain if you're producing very simple final goods. So that's again another issue that we've looked at, and we found that for Latin America they tend to, on both dimensions, diversification and complexity, they tend to be less than for other regions, and that may have implications for some of these other issues like on trade integration.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks for coming. Let's say thanks to our speakers with a round of applause, please.